Picture this. You're a foreign ambassador in 1665, invited to the court of the most powerful king in Europe. You walk through the magnificent corridors of the royal palace of Madrid, expecting to meet a majestic figure of absolute power. Instead, you encounter something that will keep you awake for weeks. The king cannot close his mouth. His jaw hangs open like a broken door. When he tries to speak, only garbled sounds and gurgles emerge. His body is so deformed he looks more like a character from a nightmare than a sovereign. His own subjects call him El Hechizado, the bewitched one. But here's the truth. No one dared speak aloud. Charles II of Spain wasn't cursed by supernatural forces. He was cursed by something far more terrifying: his own family. This is the story of how Europe's most powerful dynasty destroyed itself from within, creating a monster on the throne who would trigger one of history's bloodiest wars. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To truly understand the horror that was Charles II, we must first enter the twisted mindset of the Habsburg family. For over 2 centuries, this dynasty had ruled half the known world. Their territory stretched from Spain to the Philippines, from Austria to the Netherlands. They were masters of an empire upon which, quite literally, the sun never set. But there was a terrifying price for all this power. The Habsburgs had developed a morbid obsession with what they called keeping the bloodline pure. In their warped minds, this didn't just mean marrying people of noble birth. It meant marrying exclusively within their own family. Uncles marrying nieces, cousins marrying cousins. And when these family connections became too complicated to follow, they simply created new ones. Consider this nightmare. Charles II had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254. To put that in perspective, that's higher than what you'd have if you were the child of a brother and sister. But Charles wasn't the result of a single generation of incest. He was the final product of 11 consecutive generations of cousin marriages. Here's where it gets truly sickening. Normally, a person has 16 different great-grandparents. Charles II had only 6. His family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was a twisted spider web where the same people appeared over and over again in different positions. Anne of Austria was simultaneously his aunt, grandmother, and great-grandmother. Philip II was his grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather. Modern geneticists have calculated that Charles had less genetic diversity than a child born to parents who were full siblings. But this was the result of centuries of marriage practices that had systematically eliminated every trace of fresh blood from the royal bloodline. The Habsburg rulers knew exactly what they were doing. Court records from the 16th century show that family advisors repeatedly warned about the dangers of such close intermarriage. Spanish physicians documented increasing rates of stillbirths, infant mortality, and physical deformities in royal children. Yet the family's response was always the same: marry closer relatives, not more distant ones.
The famous Habsburg jaw was becoming more and more pronounced. Children who couldn't walk until advanced ages, fertility problems, sudden unexplained deaths. But instead of changing their practices, the Habsburgs doubled down. They were so terrified of sharing power with outsiders that they literally chose to destroy their own children rather than allow impure blood into the family. When Philip IV of Spain, Charles's father, realized his son was severely deformed, his first reaction wasn't to seek medical help. Instead, he ordered that all portraits of the child be destroyed and that no one ever speak of his physical condition outside the palace walls. The truth was too embarrassing for Europe's most powerful family. This secrecy created a horrifying cycle. Each generation of Habsburg rulers was more genetically damaged than the last. But the family's obsession with maintaining their image meant that no one could acknowledge what was happening, let alone try to fix it. When Charles II was born on November 6, 1661, the midwives fell into shocked silence. There were no traditional cries of joy. There were no bells ringing to celebrate the birth of an heir. Instead, there was a whisper of horror that spread through the palace like a contagion. The child was so physically deformed that many believed he had been born dead. His head was disproportionately large compared to his tiny body. His eyes were so far apart he looked almost alien. And his mouth was already frozen in that permanent gape that would torment his entire life. But here's the most terrifying part. No one dared say anything. The midwives were threatened with death if they ever spoke of what they had seen. Doctors were forced to sign documents swearing the prince was perfectly healthy and normal. The royal propaganda machine swung into action to hide the truth at all costs. Charles's early years were a living nightmare. He couldn't hold up his head until age 6. He couldn't walk until age 8. He couldn't speak intelligibly until age 10. Every normal developmental milestone was for him an insurmountable mountain. But perhaps the most heartbreaking part was that Charles seemed aware of his condition. Court physicians reported that the child would often cry for hours with no apparent cause, as if he were in constant pain. He couldn't sleep properly because of his jaw deformity. His tongue would constantly slip backward, blocking his airway. The wet nurses were terrified. One after another refused to care for him. Some were caught making the sign of the cross when approaching his cradle. Others whispered prayers under their breath, as if they were in the presence of something evil. Palace records from this period paint a picture of a royal household living in constant fear. Servants would draw lots to determine who had to enter the prince's chambers. Guards reported hearing strange sounds coming from his room at night. Not quite human crying, but something more disturbing. When Charles turned 5, his first official portrait was commissioned. The painter, Juan Carreno de Miranda, arrived at the palace expecting to paint an adorable royal child. What he saw instead shocked him so profoundly that he initially refused to complete the work. In letters to his wife, Miranda described the prince as more beast than boy and wrote that he had nightmares for weeks after meeting him. The final portrait, when completed, used every artistic technique available to make Charles appear as normal as possible. Yet, even these flattering attempts couldn't completely hide the reality of what the Habsburg bloodline had created. The most disturbing aspect was Charles's eyes. Miranda wrote that they held an intelligence trapped in a broken vessel. The child seemed to understand that he was different, that people were afraid of him, but couldn't comprehend why.
But children have a way of revealing truth that adults try to hide. When Charles was 7, a visiting Italian ambassador brought his young son to meet the Spanish prince. The Italian boy took one look at Charles and began screaming in terror, shouting, "Monster, monster," in his native language. The incident caused a diplomatic crisis, but more importantly, it shattered any remaining illusions about Charles's condition. The Habsburg jaw wasn't just a family trait, it was a genetic catastrophe, centuries in the making. But in Charles II, this deformity reached its absolute peak. His lower jaw projected so far forward that when he closed his mouth, there was still a gap you could slide coins through. Modern medical analysis suggests Charles suffered from severe mandibular prognathism combined with macroglossia, enlarged tongue, and possibly acromegaly. But 17th century observers could only describe what they saw, a king whose face seemed designed by a cruel god as punishment for his family's sins.
Foreign diplomats left detailed accounts of their shock upon meeting Charles. The Venetian ambassador wrote that the king's mouth hangs perpetually open, like a fish gasping for air. The French envoy described his speech as the sound a drowning man might make. Even allies of Spain couldn't hide their revulsion. Every meal became a grotesque spectacle. Charles couldn't chew solid food. His teeth didn't align at all. The upper row sat completely behind the lower row, making any kind of normal eating impossible. Palace kitchens had to prepare all his food like baby mush, everything pureed, mashed, or liquid. But even then, eating was a messy, laborious process. Soup would leak from the corners of his mouth. Any solid pieces would simply fall out. Royal dinners, which should have been displays of majesty and power, became grotesque shows where servants constantly dabbed saliva from their king's chin. The psychological impact was devastating. Charles was acutely aware of how disgusting his eating habits appeared to others. Court records show he often refused to eat in public, preferring to starve rather than endure the humiliation. This led to severe malnutrition, which only worsened his already fragile condition. Perhaps worse than his eating difficulties was Charles's speech impediment. The same jaw deformity that made eating impossible turned every royal proclamation into a struggle. His words came out as wet, slurred mumbles that even his own courtiers had trouble understanding. Foreign diplomats needed interpreters, not because of language barriers, but because they literally couldn't understand what the Spanish king was trying to say. Important matters of state had to be communicated through written messages, because verbal communication was impossible. This created a constitutional crisis. How could a king rule if he couldn't communicate with his subjects? Palace scribes worked overtime, transcribing Charles's garbled speech into written proclamations, but even they often had to guess at what he was trying to say. The most heartbreaking accounts come from Charles himself. In rare moments of clarity, he would write letters expressing his frustration at being trapped in a body that wouldn't obey his mind. One surviving letter, written in his shaky handwriting, says, "I am a prisoner in my own flesh, and God has made me king of the greatest empire on earth as some cosmic jest. The Habsburg jaw was just the tip of the iceberg." Charles II's entire body was a medical disaster, and the full extent of his deformities would have made medieval villagers cross themselves in terror. At 35 years old, Charles looked like a sick child who had been stretched and twisted by some cruel force. He barely reached 5 foot tall, but it wasn't just his height that was wrong.
His proportions were completely off. His head was massively oversized compared to his frail body, bobbing around on a neck so weak it could barely support the weight. His limbs were stick-thin and appeared almost skeletal, while his torso was oddly compressed and hunched. But the most disturbing aspect was how his body seemed to be actively deteriorating. While most people reach physical maturity and stabilize, Charles was constantly getting worse. Charles couldn't walk until he was 8 years old. Think about that for a moment. Most children take their first steps around their first birthday. Charles spent nearly a decade unable to support his own body weight. When he finally managed to walk, it was more of a stumbling shuffle. Palace records describe him lurching from wall to wall, using furniture for support like an elderly man, despite being in his supposed prime. His spine was so severely curved that he appeared permanently hunched over, giving him the silhouette of someone carrying an invisible burden. And in a way he was. The burden of generations of genetic damage concentrated into one catastrophically unlucky individual. The mental effects were equally devastating. Charles had the intellectual capacity of a child well into his adult years. He couldn't read until he was 10 years old, and even then struggled with basic comprehension. Court tutors described trying to teach him as attempting to fill a broken vessel. Information would go in, but nothing seemed to stick. His emotional regulation was that of a toddler trapped in an adult's body. Palace servants reported that Charles would throw violent tantrums over minor inconveniences, screaming and thrashing like a child denied a toy. These would be followed by periods of complete withdrawal, where he would sit motionless for hours, staring at nothing,
completely unresponsive to the world around him. Even Charles's hair betrayed his genetic damage. It grew in thin, patchy clumps that fell out regularly, leaving him with a scalp that looked more like a diseased animal's hide than a royal crown. Court painters were forced to use creative liberties in his official portraits, but even their most flattering attempts couldn't completely hide the reality of what Charles had become. His skin was pale and sickly, covered in strange rashes that court physicians couldn't explain or treat. He was constantly cold, even in the Spanish heat, requiring multiple layers of clothing that made his already odd proportions look even more bizarre. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the smell. Multiple court documents reference a peculiar odor that surrounded Charles. Not exactly unpleasant, but strange and unsettling, like something was rotting from the inside out. Modern medical experts suggest this could have been the result of various metabolic disorders caused by his extreme inbreeding. Here's where Charles II's tragic story becomes a continental disaster. The most powerful throne in Europe belonged to a man who couldn't produce a single heir. This wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a political catastrophe that would reshape the entire European balance of power. Charles married twice, desperately trying to fulfill the most basic requirement of kingship, continuing the dynasty. His first wife was Marie-Louise d'Arlenz, a French princess who arrived in Spain expecting to marry a king and instead found herself bound to what courtiers whispered was barely a man. The wedding night was reportedly a disaster of epic proportions. Palace servants later testified that Marie-Louise emerged from the royal bedchamber in tears, and Charles appeared confused and distressed. The same genetic mutations that had twisted his body had also left him functionally impotent. His reproductive organs were so underdeveloped that doctors of the era described them as infantile. Essentially, Charles had the sexual maturity of a prepubescent boy trapped in an adult's failing body. But admitting this would have been a political disaster.
So, the Spanish court chose a different strategy. Blame the woman. Instead of acknowledging Charles's condition, the court blamed Marie-Louise for being barren. She was subjected to humiliating medical examinations and painful treatments. Court physicians forced her to drink disgusting herbal concoctions, undergo invasive procedures, and endure constant scrutiny from a court that desperately needed her to produce an heir her husband was biologically incapable of providing. The psychological toll was devastating. Marie-Louise, once described as vivacious and intelligent, became withdrawn and depressed. She spent her days in prayer, begging God for a miracle that would never come. Some historians suggest she may have been slowly poisoned by the stress, treatments, and fertility medicines forced upon her. Private letters from Marie-Louise to her family in France paint a picture of absolute despair. She wrote of being married to a ghost and described Charles as more pitiful than frightening, but impossible to love. When she died, mysteriously at age 26, many suspected suicide, though the official cause was listed as appendicitis. When medical science failed to explain or cure Charles II, the Spanish court turned to the supernatural. What followed were some of the most bizarre and disturbing religious ceremonies ever performed on a living monarch. Public exorcisms conducted in the royal palace itself. The church had a simple explanation for Charles's condition. He was possessed by demons. Father Antonio Fernandez Dandars, the court's chief exorcist, declared that Charles was inhabited by multiple evil spirits that had been placed there through witchcraft, directed against the Spanish crown. But here's where it gets truly wild. These exorcisms weren't conducted in some hidden chapel. These were full-scale theatrical productions held in the throne room, with nobles and foreign dignitaries forced to watch their king writhing on the floor while priests screamed Latin incantations over his convulsing body. Father Diaz would begin each session by forcing Charles to drink holy water mixed with ground-up religious relics. The king would immediately become violently ill, probably from drinking what was essentially dirty water filled with bone fragments, which the priests interpreted as demons fighting the holy substances.
Charles would vomit, shake uncontrollably, and sometimes lose consciousness, while Father Diaz shouted that he could see the devils leaving the king's body. The ceremonies could last for hours, with Charles Minus, already weak and confused, being subjected to aggressive physical manipulations as priests attempted to literally wrestle demons from his flesh. They would press crucifixes against his skin until he screamed, splash him with holy water, and force him to recite prayers in Latin, a language he could barely comprehend given his intellectual limitations. Foreign ambassadors wrote detailed accounts of these sessions, describing them as more disturbing than any torture they had witnessed in war. But the exorcists didn't stop with Charles himself. They became convinced that the entire royal palace was cursed, leading to one of the most bizarre episodes in royal history. In 1698, Father Diaz ordered a systematic purification of the palace that resembled something between spring cleaning and supernatural warfare. Servants were ordered to collect every item that might be contaminated by witchcraft. This included personal belongings of previous queens, gifts from foreign courts, and even pieces of furniture. These objects were carried to the palace courtyard and burned in massive bonfires while priests chanted exorcism prayers. The smoke from these fires was so thick and acrid that it could be seen from Madrid city center. Citizens gathered in the streets, wondering if the royal palace was under attack. The reality was somehow even more absurd. Their king was burning his own possessions to drive away imaginary demons. The most disturbing part was that Charles seemed to believe it was working. His limited mental capacity made him susceptible to suggestion, and when priests told him the demons were being expelled, he would experience temporary relief from his constant physical pain. This created a horrific cycle where Charles would beg for more exorcisms whenever his symptoms worsened.
He became convinced that his physical ailments were spiritual attacks and that only increasingly extreme religious interventions could save him. Palace records show that Charles underwent over 50 formal exorcism sessions during the last 5 years of his life. Each one left him weaker and more mentally disturbed. Yet he continued to demand them, terrified that without constant spiritual cleansing, the demons would fully possess his body and soul. The Habsburg dynasty's pursuit of absolute power through genetic purity ultimately destroyed everything they sought to protect. Their empire crumbled, their bloodline ended, and their final king became a cautionary tale about the dangers of defying natural law. Charles II died alone, abandoned by a body that had been designed by centuries of genetic roulette. His autopsy revealed the true cost of his family's obsessions, a collection of organs so damaged they seemed to belong to different species entirely. But Charles's story isn't just about one family's tragic mistakes. It's about the universal human tendency to choose short-term power over long-term survival, to prioritize control over health, to believe that human will can overcome biological reality. The Habsburgs thought they could concentrate power indefinitely by keeping it within the family. They believed their bloodline was so superior that mixing it with others would only weaken it. They were catastrophically wrong, and Charles II paid the ultimate price for their hubris. Today, we see similar patterns in different forms. Isolated communities that don't intermarry with outsiders often suffer from increased rates of genetic disorders. Elite families that only marry within their social class sometimes perpetuate harmful recessive traits. The principle remains the same. Genetic isolation leads to biological collapse. Charles II's deformed body was evolution's verdict on the Habsburg strategy. Nature had rendered its judgment on centuries of genetic manipulation, and that judgment was written in twisted bones, malformed organs, and a jaw that couldn't close. Perhaps the greatest irony of all is that Charles II, the most genetically pure Habsburg, was also the most powerless.
All those centuries of carefully controlled marriages had produced a king who couldn't speak clearly, couldn't eat normally, couldn't produce an heir, and could barely govern his own body, let alone an empire. The pursuit of genetic purity had created its perfect opposite, a ruler so impure in his biological function that he represented the complete failure of everything his dynasty stood for. Charles II wasn't the culmination of Habsburg greatness, he was its absolute negation, the final proof that their entire strategy was doomed from the beginning. Today, when we see Charles II's portraits in museums, we're looking at more than just a historical figure. We're seeing the physical manifestation of human arrogance, the biological consequence of choosing power over health, the genetic result of defying natural selection. His twisted features serve as a permanent reminder that no amount of political power can overcome biological reality. The Habsburgs learned this lesson too late, and Charles II paid the price with his life, his dignity, and ultimately his dynasty's survival. The most powerful empire in Europe fell because its rulers forgot that they were fundamentally human beings, subject to the same natural laws as everyone else. Charles II's broken body was nature's final definitive response to centuries of genetic manipulation. In the end, evolution had the last word, and that word was written in the deformed flesh of the last Habsburg, King of Spain.